You know, it's funny. When we think about the architects of the modern world, the people who actually drew the borders and shifted human history, we usually expect to see their faces.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. We expect statues.
Right. Marble statues in the city square, or like their profile stamped on a gold coin.
I mean, it's entirely human to want a face to anchor the history to. We build these narratives around a visual legacy.
We do. We want to look into the eyes of the person who caused the earthquake.
Mm.
But then you step into the world of the 13th century Eurasian steppes, and suddenly the biggest architect of them all is essentially a ghost.
He really is. Which is wild when you think about it.
It's so wild because despite forging the largest contiguous land empire in human history, I mean, an empire from the Pacific Ocean all the way to the Mediterranean Sea, Genghis Khan never allowed his portrait to be painted.
Not even once.
Not once while he was alive. He never let his image be sculpted in clay, never engraved on a coin. Every single thing we visualize about him today, the paintings, those towering statues, it was all created entirely after he died.
And that is just a brilliant, almost eerie contradiction.
Right.
Because the man whose very specific decisions connected the globe in ways that had, frankly, absolutely never been seen before, he erased his own image. I mean, his legacy still dictates modern borders.
Yeah.
It dictates the genetic makeup of millions of people today.
Yeah, but he deliberately wiped himself from the contemporary visual record. We can't look at him at all. We can only look at this massive, world-altering crater he left behind.
I love that image. Standing in the crater of the Mongol Empire.
And that crater is exactly what we're exploring in today's deep dive. We are looking at just a mountain of sources for this one. We've got historical texts, translated chronicles, academic papers, and even a physical silver-inlaid artifact.
Which is such a cool piece of the puzzle.
It really is. And our mission today is to figure out how a starving, enslaved outcast built a machine that conquered the earth. Because you have to imagine trying to build a corporate conglomerate today that spans from Beijing to Baghdad, right? But you're starting as a homeless teenager with a literal wooden collar locked around your neck. I mean, how does that happen?
It sounds impossible.
Exactly. And then how does that hyper-violent expansion inadvertently create the first true era of globalization?
Well, to answer that, we really have to throw away all our modern assumptions about power and, pedigree.
We have to start at the absolute bottom.
The very bottom, in one of the most unforgiving environments on the planet.
So take us there. Take us to the Mongolian plateau in the late 12th century. The boy who will become Genghis Khan is born around 1162, and his given name is Temüjin. And he is definitely not born into a stable royal court.
Oh, not at all, no. The steppe at this time is a hyper-volatile, hyper-militarized meat grinder.
A meat grinder. That's a good way to put it.
I mean, it was. You have all these disparate nomadic tribes,
Mm-hmm.
the Mongols, the Karaites, the Naimans, the Merkits, the Tartars, and they are locked in this endless, brutal cycle of raiding.
Just constant warfare.
Constant. They steal horses, they kidnap women, they murder rivals. And it's important to note for our listeners that this chaos wasn't just like natural tribal friction.
Oh, it was engineered.
Actively engineered. The sedentary Jin dynasty, who were sitting securely down to the south in China, they deliberately funneled resources to different tribes at different times.
So it was a classic divide and rule strategy.
But exactly. They wanted to ensure that the nomads were always too busy slitting each other's throats to ever look south and threaten the Jin borders.
Right, like keep the neighbors fighting over the fence so they don't break into your house.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And Temüjin is born right into the center of this engineered chaos.
Yeah.
So his father, Yasugai, is a minor chieftain of the Borjigin clan. But any semblance of stability that Temüjin has vanishes when he's just a boy.
Because his father is poisoned, right?
Yes. Poisoned by the rival Tartar tribe.
Yeah.
And the aftermath of that assassination is what really sets the stage for everything Temüjin becomes.
Because steppe politics in the 12th century were incredibly cruel. I mean, very pragmatic but cruel.
Extremely. When a leader dies, his family goes from being royalty to being an absolute liability practically overnight.
Wow.
Yeah. A widow with young children can't hunt, she can't fight, and she consumes precious resources. So Temüjin's own clan, his blood relatives, they make a calculated decision.
They just leave him.
They pack up their camps, they ride off, and they completely abandon Temüjin, his mother Holin, and his siblings on the frozen steppe.
Which is essentially handing them a death sentence.
Oh, 100%.
I always try to put myself in Holin's shoes. I mean, his mother. You're alone in an environment where winter temperatures drop to 40 below zero, and your entire support network has just vanished over the horizon.
It's terrifying. But she refuses to let her kids die.
Yeah, the historical chronicles describe her running up and down the Anon River, just desperately foraging for wild roots, picking wild apples.
Catching whatever fish she can get her hands on.
They were eating rats and marmots just to survive the winters. It's absolute scraping the bottom destitution.
And that level of poverty creates an incredible vulnerability. Because they have no clan protection, they're easy targets.
Which leads to him getting captured.
Right. Temüjin is actually captured by a rival tribe, the THIS, and enslaved.
And this isn't just like indentured servitude. They put him in a kang.
Yes, a kang,
Yeah.
which is a heavy wooden board locked around the neck and wrists. You can't feed yourself. You can't even swat a fly from your face.
Yeah.
You are treated like a dangerous animal.
Okay, so stop right there, because this is the foundational question of this entire deep dive.
Yeah.
You're a teenager. You've been abandoned by your own aristocratic bloodline. You are literally in chains, eating roots. You have zero wealth, zero soldiers, zero status.
Nothing.
How in the world do you go from wearing a wooden collar to conquering Eurasia? I mean, how do you even take the very first step out of that situation?
Well, you realize that the rules of the game are broken, and you invent new ones. That trauma, the abandonment and the enslavement, it fundamentally rewired Temüjin's worldview. He learned the hardest possible way that traditional aristocratic structures were useless.
Because blood loyalties didn't protect him.
Exactly. Loyalties based purely on who your father was meant absolutely nothing. So after he manages this daring escape from the wooden collar, he realizes he needs capital.
But he's broke.
He's completely broke. He has no money, no army. So he leverages the only capital available to him, which is strategic, unbreakable interpersonal alliances.
Right. He needs a network. He has to build a network from scratch.
Precisely. And he starts by seeking out his childhood betrothed, a young woman named Borte from the Anjarat tribe.
And amazingly, her family actually honors the betrothal, right?
Right.
Which gives him his very first fragile connection to a broader network.
It does.
But the brilliance of Temüjin isn't just that he got married. It's what he does with the wedding gifts.
Oh, this is such a key moment.
It's incredible, because as part of the dowry, his new in-laws give him this magnificent black sable coat. Now, in a society that is constantly battling hypothermia, a pristine sable coat is an unimaginable luxury.
It's like someone handing him a briefcase full of $100 bills.
Exactly. And most teenagers who grew up starving would immediately put that coat on and walk around showing it off to everyone.
Of course they would. But Temüjin views it purely as seed funding.
Yes.
He doesn't wear it. He packs it up and immediately journeys to find Togrul, who is the incredibly powerful Khan of the Karit tribe.
And Togrul had a connection to his father, right?
Right. Togrul had been an Anda, a blood brother, to Temüjin's murdered father. So Temüjin walks right into Togrul's camp, presents this priceless sable coat, and he doesn't just offer it as a nice gift.
He frames it as an act of absolute submission.
Yes. He tells the Khan, "In gratitude, I look upon you as my father. I will be your right hand."
So he literally buys himself a surrogate father who just happens to have a massive army.
A very smart investment.
Which turns out to be the smartest insurance policy he could have ever purchased, because almost immediately, disaster strikes again.
It always does on the steppe.
The Merkit tribe, who had this decades-old blood feud with Temüjin's father, they raid Temüjin's camp in the dead of night, and they kidnap his new wife, Borte.
And we should note, this was standard operating procedure for steppe warfare. Retaliatory kidnapping was very common.
Right, so the traditional response for a guy in Temüjin's position, a guy who barely has a handful of followers, would just be to mourn the loss and go find a new wife.
Yeah, just accept defeat. But Temüjin refuses to accept the status quo, so he activates that new network. He rides directly to Togrul and cashes in that sable coat.
He calls him the favor.
He calls him the massive favor. And he also calls upon his own childhood blood brother, a young, very charismatic rising star on the steppe named Jamuka.
So now you have these three leaders. You have the established Khan, Togrul. You have the young rising star, Jamuka. And you have Temüjin.
And they pool their forces right out, and they just completely crush the Merkits.
They get Borte back.
They get Borte back. It's a massive victory. And for a while after this, Temüjin and his blood brother, Jamuka, actually merge their camps. They lead this combined victorious following together.
But this is where the sources show a massive structural fracture forming between these two friends.
It is a profound ideological divergence.
Yeah.
And honestly, It really sets the template for the entire Mongol Empire going forward.
How so?
Because Jamuka represents the old guard. He believes deeply in the traditional steppe aristocracy. In Jamuka's camp, you only get command of troops, you only get a seat at the leadership table if you have noble blood.
Oh, I see.
If you are born a lowly shepherd, you will die a lowly shepherd no matter how good you are with a bow.
I always compare this to a rivalry in Silicon Valley.
Oh, that's a great way to look at it.
Right, like Jamuka is running a legacy blue-chip corporation. The only way you get a corner office is if you went to Yale, your dad was a senator, and you belong to the right country club.
Completely pedigree-based.
Totally. And then you have Temüjin, who sets up this disruptive garage-based startup right next door. And Temüjin says, I don't care if your parents were destitute. I don't care if you used to herd sheep. If you can shoot an arrow from a galloping horse and follow my orders without question, I will make you a general.
And to take your startup analogy a step further, Temüjin wasn't just offering promotions based on merit. He was completely restructuring the equity of the whole operation.
How do you mean?
Well, in the traditional system, when a tribe looted an enemy, the aristocrats naturally took all the best horses, the best armor, the best captives.
And the commoners got the scraps.
Exactly. The common warriors got whatever was left in the dirt. But Temüjin instituted a system where all loot was gathered centrally and then distributed fairly among all his nokers.
His loyal personal warrior.
Right. Regardless of their birth status, he even made sure that the widows and orphans of his fallen soldiers received a share of the loot.
Which is incredibly radical for the 12th century. I mean, if you're just an average guy on the steppe and you see Jamuka treating you like dirt because of your last name,
Yeah.
and then you look over at Temujin's camp where former shepherds are wearing silk and commanding armies, I mean, the choice is pretty obvious.
The lower and middle classes absolutely flocked him. It was an existential threat to the aristocratic order. Jamuka recognized this, and it sparked a bitter 2-decade-long civil war between the former blood brothers.
2 decades.
Yeah. And this period is essentially Temujin's crucible. It's where he really hones his military genius. Because he wasn't just a charismatic populist, he was a brilliant, highly adaptive tactician.
Okay, give me an example of that adaptation. Because I feel like a lot of people think the Mongols just won by having overwhelming numbers, you know, like a human wave.
That is a huge misconception. In fact, they were frequently outnumbered.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Look at the decisive battle against the Nayman tribe around 1204. The Naymans were a massive, powerful confederation, and Temujin's forces were numerically inferior.
So what does he do?
He leans heavily into psychological warfare. The night before the battle, he orders every single one of his soldiers to light 5 campfires, spacing them out across the plains.
Oh, that's brilliant.
Right, so if you're a Nayman scout looking down from the mountains in the pitch black, you're trying to count the enemy by their fires.
And suddenly it looks like they have 5 times as many men.
Precisely. The Nayman commanders looked out, and contemporary accounts say it looked like there were more fires than stars in the sky.
Whoa.
The illusion of a gargantuan, overwhelming force completely demoralized the Nayman leadership before a single arrow was ever fired.
They beat themselves.
They hesitated, their formations fractured, and Temüjin just obliterated them. And with the fall of the Nayman, the last major resistance on the steppe crumbled. Even Jamuka was eventually betrayed by his own men and brought before Temüjin in chains.
And the execution of Jamuka is this really dark, poetic moment in the sources. Temüjin actually offers his old friend a place by his side. He says they can rule together.
But Jamuka refuses. He knows the steppe isn't big enough for 2 sons.
Yeah. He just asks for a noble death.
Yes, because in Mongol tradition, the blood of an aristocrat was considered sacred. Spilling it on the earth was a massive taboo. It would anger the spirits.
So Temüjin honors the request. He has Jamuka rolled up in a carpet and has his back broken.
So no blood touches the ground.
It's brutal, but it firmly closes the book on the old aristocratic order. Which brings us to 1206, a defining moment in world history.
The Kurultai.
Yes. Having conquered, assimilated, or allied with every single warring tribe on the plateau, Temüjin calls a Kurultai. But what actually happens at a Kurultai, because the way it's described, it sounds like just a big meeting, but it's clearly much more than that.
It is a massive political, religious, and logistical event. I mean, imagine thousands of tents stretching for miles near the sacred mountain of Burkhan Khaldun.
Just a sea of people.
Right. It's part election, part coronation, and part constitutional convention. The tribal leaders, many of whom were former enemies, they gather to formally acknowledge the new reality.
And this is where he gets the new name.
Yes. They raised Temüjin up on a white felt carpet, and a shaman declares that the spirits have recognized him. He is given the title Genghis Khan.
Which translates roughly to universal ruler or oceanic ruler.
Exactly.
So this kid who is eating marmots in a wooden collar is now the absolute dictator of the Yek Mongol Ulis, the great Mongol nation. He has united 1 million nomads. But this actually immediately creates a terrifying ticking clock, doesn't it?
It does. You're touching on the fundamental structural flaw of what he just built.
Because he's got all these warriors now.
Right. He had taken dozens of tribes whose entire economy, culture, and social structure were based on warfare and raiding, and he welded them into a single machine. But an engine designed for war will tear itself apart if it's left idling.
It needs somewhere to go.
If Genghis Khan didn't point this incredibly lethal, heavily armed society at an external target, they would inevitably turn their bows back on each other.
Wait, so was the conquest of the rest of the world just a cynical political strategy? Like, just find an external boogeyman to stop them from killing each other?
Well, it's deeper than that.
Hmm.
Politics played a role, sure, but we really have to look at the environment here.
Okay.
This is where historical climatology gives us an incredible insight into the why of the Mongol expansion. Tree ring data from the region shows that the years leading up to Genghis Khan's rise, roughly 1211 to 1225, were characterized by an incredibly rare period of unusually warm, wet weather on the steppe.
And more rain means more grass.
Exactly. And more grass means an absolute explosion in the livestock population. You have to remember, a Mongol warrior didn't ride one horse into battle.
Right, they had a whole string of them.
He rode with a string of 5 or 6 remounts so he could switch horses on the fly and never slow down. So to field an army of 100,000 men, you need a massive, continuous sea of grass to feed 500,000 horses.
Oh, wow. So that wet period literally fueled the biological engine of the Mongol war machine.
It really did. But then the climate violently shifts.
The sources mention extreme droughts following that wet period, just a sudden, sharp drop in temperature.
The grass stops growing. So suddenly, you have a massive, hyper-militarized population with millions of animals, and they are literally looking at starvation.
So it's an ecological push.
It is. The environment forces them to look south toward the wealthy, agricultural, sedentary societies just to survive.
So you combine this desperate ecological push, like we have to expand or starve, with an incredibly potent ideological pull. Because Genghis Khan genuinely believed he wasn't just a king, but a divine instrument.
Yes. The Mongols practiced animism with a supreme reverence for Tengri, the eternal blue sky. And over time, Genghis Khan developed this unshakable, terrifying conviction that Tengri had granted him a divine mandate to rule the entire earth.
Not just the steppe, the whole world.
The world. In his mind, submitting to the Mongols was submitting to God's will. Resisting the Mongols wasn't just political defiance, it was a religious heresy that justified absolute annihilation.
But believing you have the right to conquer the world and actually pulling it off are two very different things.
Definitely.
To take down the massive walled cities of China or the Middle East, he couldn't just use a loose confederation of horse archers. He had to build something completely new.
He fundamentally dismantled and restructured the entirety of steppe society to serve the military. He introduced what we call the decimal system.
Right. Break that down for us.
He took the entire population and broke them down into units of 10, called an arban. 10 arbans formed a zun of 100. 10 zuns formed a mingan of 1,000. And 10 of those formed a tumen of 10,000 warriors.
And the genius stroke here is how he populated those units. He didn't just put 10 carters in one arban and 10 markets in another, did he?
No. He actively shattered the old tribal bonds. He mixed men from historically rival tribes into the same 10-man squads.
Wow.
You were no longer a Kharat, you were a soldier of the great Khan. And he bound them together with a brutal code of collective responsibility.
How brutal.
If one man in an arban of 10 deserted in the middle of a battle, the other 9 were executed for letting him flee.
Oh my God. Your life literally depended on the guy next to you, even if your fathers had killed each other 10 years ago.
It forces a terrifying level of unit cohesion.
I bet. And at the top of this structure, he builds the Kishig, this elite royal guard that grew to 10,000 men. But they weren't just bodyguards standing around a tent, right?
Not at all. The Kishig was brilliant. It operated as a combination of elite shock troops, a secret service, and an imperial military academy.
An academy.
Yes, Genghis Khan required his top generals and commanders to send their sons to serve in the Kishig. Now, on one level, this is a sophisticated hostage system.
Right, your generals won't rebel if you have their son sleeping by your tent.
Exactly. But on another level, these young men were being trained directly by the Khan himself. They learned advanced logistics, administration, and strategy.
So they were the future leaders.
Yes. When the empire expanded, the graduates of the Kishig were the ones sent out as generals and imperial governors. It was a conveyor belt of elite administrative talent.
So with this perfectly disciplined, fiercely loyal war machine, he turns south, he looks at China, and at this time China is split. You have the Western Jia, but the real giant is the Jin dynasty in the north.
The Jin were formidable.
They had massive agricultural wealth, sprawling fortified cities, and an army numbering over 1 million men. To them, a nomad invasion is probably just seen as a border nuisance.
They vastly underestimated what Genghis Khan had built.
Yeah.
Vastly. When the Mongols invaded the Jin territory in 1211, they didn't fight like a typical raiding party. They brought a level of operational coordination that the sedentary armies just couldn't comprehend.
How did they coordinate?
Mongol units communicated seamlessly across miles of battlefield, using black and white flags during the day and flaming arrows at night.
And they perfected the feigned retreat, which is arguably one of the most difficult military maneuvers in history.
Extremely difficult. The Mongol vanguard would hit the heavy Jin infantry, fight for a bit, and then suddenly break formation in apparent panic. They drop weapons and flee.
And to a Jin commander, it looks like a rout.
Right, so the heavy cavalry breaks their defensive lines to chase them down.
The Mongols are on faster, lighter horses.
Exactly. They draw the Jin forces out for miles, stretching their lines until the Jin horses are exhausted. And then, at a signal, the fleeing Mongols suddenly wheel their horses around, form a crescent shape, and surround the pursuing army.
And they just annihilate them with the composite bow.
A Mongol archer could hit a target with armor-piercing arrows from hundreds of yards away while riding at a full gallop. They completely dismantled the Jin field armies.
But a wall is a wall. Mobility doesn't matter if the enemy is hiding behind 40 feet of solid stone. You can't shoot an arrow through that. I mean, nomads don't carry battering rams in their saddlebags.
You can't shoot through stone, and initially the Mongols actually had no idea how to breach them. Yeah, they tried starvation, they tried primitive assaults, and they took heavy casualties. But this is where Mongol pragmatism shines. They didn't invent siege engines.
They captured the people who did?
Precisely. They captured Chinese siege engineers, they offered them wealth and elevated status in the Mongol ranks if they cooperated, and death if they refused.
Oh, wow. They just outsourced their engineering.
They did. Suddenly, this light cavalry force from the steppe is deploying massive Chinese catapults, traction trebuchets, and scaling ladders. They adapted instantly.
That's terrifying.
And if a city still wouldn't follow the machines, the Mongols would force tens of thousands of captured peasants to build massive dams, and they would literally divert the course of nearby rivers to wash the city walls away.
They turned warfare into an industrial process. So they sack the Jin capital of Zhongdu, which is near modern Beijing, but Genghis Khan doesn't even want to occupy it. He takes the plunder and heads back to the steppe. Which brings us to a moment in the sources that just blows my mind, because it might be the most catastrophic diplomatic blunder in the history of the human race. The clash with the Islamic Khwarezmian Empire.
It is a massive turning point in global history.
It's at the stage worse.
So by 1218, the Mongol conquests in Central Asia brought their borders right up against the Khwarezmian Empire. This was a vast, incredibly wealthy Islamic state that covered modern-day Iran, Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. And it was ruled by Shah Muhammad II.
And here's the craziest part. Genghis Khan actually didn't want a war with them.
No, he didn't.
The sources are very clear on this. He saw them as a lucrative trading partner. He writes a letter to the Shah saying, "I am the master of the lands of the rising sun, and you are the master of the lands of the setting sun. Let us have a firm treaty of friendship and peace."
It was a very reasonable diplomatic overture.
Yeah, and he sends a massive caravan, hundreds of merchants carrying silver, silk, and furs, to the Khwarezmian border city of Otrar to open trade.
But the governor of Otrar, a man named Inalchuk, makes a fatal, greedy miscalculation. He sees the wealth of the caravan, seizes the goods, accuses the merchants of being Mongol spies, and slaughters almost all of them.
Now, you'd think Genghis Khan would immediately just unleash the horde, but he is surprisingly restrained. He
Yes.
wants the goods and he wants the governor, but he doesn't want a multi-front war. So he sends 3 official envoys, 1 Muslim and 2 Mongols, directly to Shah Muhammad II in his capital, demanding that the governor be handed over for punishment. He actually gives the Shah a diplomatic off-ramp.
And Shah Muhammad's response is just dripping with arrogance. He is insulted that a barbarian king from a felt tent would make demands of him. So the Shah has the Muslim envoy beheaded. Then he shaves the beards off the 2 Mongol envoys and sends them back to Genghis Khan in disgrace.
Okay, let me stop you there, because to a modern listener, shaving a beard sounds like a frat prank, not a reason to burn down half of Asia. Explain the gravity of that.
In Mongol culture, and specifically under the code Genghis Khan established, the person of an ambassador was absolutely sacrosanct. They were untouchable.
Right.
To harm an envoy wasn't just a political insult, it was a cosmic crime. It was a direct violation of the universal order ordained by Tengri. By killing the envoy and mutilating the others, Shah Muhammad guaranteed a war of absolute extermination.
The response is apocalyptic. Genghis Khan halts his campaigns in China. He gathers an army estimated at around 200,000 warriors, which is likely the largest nomadic force ever assembled.
A terrifying force.
He brings his most brilliant generals, Subutai and Jebi. They cross the mountains in 1219 and descend on the Khwarezmian Empire like a force of nature.
And Shah Muhammad, despite having a larger army on paper, makes a catastrophic strategic error.
What does he do?
Well, he fears his own generals might rebel if he puts the entire army under one command, so he fractures his forces, placing them as defensive garrisons inside various walled cities across the empire.
He assumes the Mongols will just break themselves against the walls, but he doesn't know about the Chinese siege engines.
Exactly. It allowed Genghis Khan to divide his forces and systematically defeat the Khwarezmian army in detail, city by terrifying city. They hit Otrar first. They besieged it for 5 months, and when the walls finally breached, they captured Governor Inalchuk, the man who slaughtered the merchants.
And Genghis Khan exacts a highly symbolic, horrific revenge. He has molten silver poured directly into the governor's eyes and ears.
It's gruesome.
It's a grotesque punishment for his greed, but it's also a broadcast to the rest of the empire, right? Like, this is what happens when you cross the Khan.
And it was just the prologue. The Mongol war machine rolled through the great intellectual and cultural centers of the Islamic world: Bukhara, Samarkand, Urgench. The devastation was on a scale that contemporary chroniclers struggle to even articulate.
There's a moment during the sack of Bukhara that sounds like something out of a myth. The Mongols breach the city. Genghis Khan rides his horse directly into the Great Friday Mosque, which is a massive desecration.
Yeah, unheard of.
He rides up, calls the surviving elite and scholars of the city to the courtyard, and looks down at them from his horse. And he tells them, "O people, know that you have committed great sins. If you ask me what proof I have for these words, I say it is because I am the punishment of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you."
It is a masterclass in psychological domination. Genghis Khan recognized that fear was a far more efficient weapon than arrows. The Mongols employed highly calculated terror as an instrument of state policy.
Give us an example of that policy in action.
Like the city of Urgench, for example. The defenders resisted fiercely, engaging the Mongols in brutal, bloody street-to-street fighting that caused heavy Mongol casualties.
And the Mongols do not tolerate casualties.
No, they don't. When Urgench finally fell, the retaliation was absolute. They diverted the Amu Darya River to physically wash the remnants of the city away. The chronicles, which, to be fair, were likely exaggerated by the Mongols themselves to spread fear, they claim that after the city fell, each individual Mongol warrior was given a quota of 24 civilians to execute personally.
Wait, I'm struggling to reconcile this. How does a leader orchestrate that level of calculated, almost industrial slaughter, and then turn around and build an empire known for trade and administration? Was this just mindless bloodlust?
It wasn't mindless at all. That's the chilling part. It was deeply strategic. By utterly annihilating a city that resisted, they saved Mongol lives in the long run.
How does that work?
Because the news of Urgench or Samarkand would travel down the trade routes. So when the Mongol vanguard arrived at the gates of the next 5 cities, the mayors would look at the Mongol banners, realize resistance meant total erasure, and simply open the gates and surrender their wealth without a single arrow being fired.
Terror was a tool of efficiency.
Precisely. Shah Muhammad fled for his life, chased by a Mongol detachment across his own crumbling empire, and eventually died of dysentery on a tiny island in the Caspian Sea, wearing rags. The empire was erased.
And Genghis Khan returns to Mongolia. But as we look at the timeline, this is where the narrative shifts, because as the old proverb goes, you can conquer an empire from horseback, but you cannot govern it from horseback.
A profound realization for a nomadic warlord. Genghis Khan recognized that extracting wealth required stability. You can't tax a burning city.
Right.
This marks the transition into the era of administration, the foundation of what historians call the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace.
So how does a pre-literate nomadic society build a legal and bureaucratic framework for an empire spanning millions of square miles and dozens of distinct cultures?
He starts by laying down a universal law, the Yasa. This was a strict, largely secret legal code that bound everyone, from the lowest shepherd all the way up to the Khan himself.
Wait, the Khan was subject to the law too?
Absolutely. The Yasa regulated military discipline, the sharing of loot, and environmental protections, like forbidding the washing of bloody clothes in rivers to appease the water spirits.
Okay.
Crucially, it strictly outlawed the kidnapping of women, the theft of animals, and the enslaving of fellow Mongols, the exact chaotic practices that had murdered his father and enslaved him as a boy. He legislated the chaos out of the steppe.
But earlier you said they were preliterate. If you don't have an alphabet, how do you enforce a massive legal code across 2 continents?
You adapt. In 1204, right after defeating the Naiman, Genghis Khan captured an eager scribe named Tatartonga. He ordered this scribe to adapt the Uyghur alphabet, which actually has its roots in ancient Syriac, to the Mongolian spoken language.
Wow, just like that.
Almost overnight, the Mongols had a written script. They could record the Yasa, they could maintain complex tax registries, and they could issue written imperial decrees to the far corners of the earth.
And to deliver those decrees, they construct arguably the most impressive logistical achievement of the medieval world, the YAM system.
The YAM was a massive, highly synchronized postal relay system. They built permanent stations every 20 to 30 miles across the entire Eurasian landmass.
Let's dive into the mechanics of the YAM, because the scale is mind-boggling. We're talking about a network that utilized 50,000 horses.
It's massive.
They had massive herds of oxen to move heavy carts, and my favorite detail from the sources, up in the freezing, snowy reaches of Manchuria, they even maintained packs of up to 3,000 sled dogs to keep the mail moving through the winter.
It was unparalleled efficiency. A Mongol messenger would ride into a station, immediately swap his exhausted horse for a fresh one, grab a hot meal, and ride out in minutes. Using the YAM, an imperial decree could travel up to 200 miles in a single day.
But if you build a highway system filled with fresh horses and food, how do you stop local warlords or bandits from just commandeering it?
Right.
This brings us to a really incredible artifact mentioned in the sources, currently housed at the Rubin Museum of Art. It's called a paisa, or a gerij in Mongolian.
It's a brilliant piece of administrative technology. The specific artifact we're looking at is a heavy iron tablet, about 7 inches long. It has this incredibly intricate silver inlay and an engraving of an intimidating animal face, a lion, or perhaps a dragon. At the top, there's a loop so a rider could hang it securely from his belt.
And it has an inscription written in the Pakpa script, which was a universal alphabet commissioned later by Kublai Khan. The inscription is essentially a terrifying imperial command. It says, "By the strength of eternal heaven, an edict of the emperor, he who has no respect shall be Dalti."
Holding that silver tablet gave a Mongol messenger absolute, unquestionable authority. It was a VIP pass, backed by the threat of total annihilation.
I mean, you can't argue with that.
No, if a dusty, exhausted rider pulled into a station wearing a silver or gold paisa, the local administrators dropped everything. They gave him their absolute best horses, their finest rations, and an armed escort if he needed it. To deny a paisa holder was to deny the Khan himself, which was an immediate death sentence.
And this incredible infrastructure, which was originally built purely for military command and control, inevitably evolves. Because once the conquests slow down, the Mongols realize something fundamental about economics.
They realized that taxing an active, healthy trade network over centuries is infinitely more profitable than looting a city once.
Which leads to the birth of the first true era of globalization. For the first time in human history, the entire Silk Road, stretching all the way from the Pacific coast of China to the shores of the Mediterranean, was controlled by a single, unified political entity.
And the Mongols made it aggressively safe. There was a saying that a virgin carrying a sack of gold could walk from one end of the empire to the other without fear of being molested.
And they actively subsidized this globalization, didn't they? The Mongol elites partnered with merchants, mostly Central Asian Muslims, forming joint ventures called ortoks.
Explain the mechanism of an ortok, because nomads aren't naturally venture capitalists.
Oh, wait, I can take this one. It functioned very much like early venture capital. A Mongol prince or queen would provide the silver capital to a merchant guild.
Right.
The merchants would take that capital, travel safely on the yam routes, buy goods in China, sell them in Persia, and bring the profits back to split with their Mongol backers.
Exactly. The empire essentially underwrote the financial risk of global trade. They created a hyper-integrated Eurasian macroeconomy.
And the material exchange is just staggering. From the east, you have massive shipments of silk, satin, damask, muslin, and porcelain flowing into Europe and the Middle East. You have the introduction of the blast furnace. The sources even mention that playing cards made their way to Europe thanks to the Mongols.
And it flowed both ways. Lemons, carrots, and advanced weaving techniques moved from the Islamic world into China. But the intellectual and technological exchange is what truly reshapes the world. The Mongol courts in China and Persia became cosmopolitan hubs. The Khans actively recruited Muslim astronomers to build advanced observatories in Beijing.
And the medical exchange. Chinese doctors traveled west and shared their knowledge of pharmacology, pulse diagnosis, and herbal medicines, while Muslim physicians introduced advanced surgical techniques to China.
And most consequentially, the Mongols transported Chinese gunpowder technologies to the west. They brought fire lances, bombs, and early cannons across the steppes, fundamentally altering the trajectory of European warfare and ultimately global dominance.
Which brings me to a huge contradiction. We just spent 20 minutes talking about how they poured molten silver into people's eyes, wiped out cities, and piled up skulls. How does that same leadership turn around and sponsor scientific exchanges and, incredibly, mandate religious tolerance?
It is the great paradox of the Mongols. They were notoriously tolerant of diverse religions. Within the borders of the empire, you had Tibetan Buddhists, Nestorian Christians, Sunni and Shia Muslims, Taoists, and animists.
But was this actual progressive open-mindedness or just a cynical strategy to keep the conquered populations docile?
It was hardcore utilitarianism. The Mongols viewed religion as a practical tool for dealing with the spiritual world. They believed Tengri was supreme, but they figured it couldn't hurt to have the priests of other gods praying for the Khan's long life.
Cover your bases.
Exactly. So they granted sweeping tax exemptions to clerics, monks, and imams of all faiths, provided they prayed for the Mongol leadership. Furthermore, Genghis Khan realized from his youth that internal religious persecution was terrible for business and stability. He instituted religious freedom as a pragmatic tool for imperial harmony.
It is a staggering reality, a utopian era of free trade, diplomatic immunity, paper money, and religious freedom, but built entirely on the ashes of millions. The Pax Mongolica was real, but its foundation was drenched in blood.
But that utopian exchange of ideas and goods held a fatal flaw. The Mongols had built a world entirely dependent on the charismatic authority of one man's bloodline. And when Genghis Khan died in 1227, that perfectly oiled machine suddenly faced a catastrophic structural crisis.
Right, because Genghis Khan never actually codified a clear law of succession. He just decreed that the ruler must be a descendant of his golden family, his Altan Ura.
Exactly. And since Genghis had many sons, who had many sons, who had many sons, well, within a few decades, you have dozens of heavily armed, fiercely ambitious princes who all possess a legitimate, divine claim to rule the entire world.
It's a recipe for endless civil war. Every time a great Khan dies, the entire global expansion just stops.
It did. For example, in 1241, the Mongol armies were tearing through Eastern Europe. They had annihilated the armies of Poland and Hungary and were poised to push into the Holy Roman Empire. Western Europe was on the brink of absolute destruction.
But then something happens.
A messenger arrived on a horse. Ogedai Khan, Genghis' successor, had drank himself to death in Mongolia. By Mongol law, all the senior commanders and princes had to immediately pull their armies back and return thousands of miles to the steppe for a kurultai to elect the next leader. Europe was saved purely by Mongol bureaucracy.
That's incredible. But those elections became increasingly toxic, right? The breaking point really hits after the death of Mongol Khan in 1259. You get the Tuluid Civil War, a massive, bloody conflict between two of Genghis Khan's grandsons, Kublai Khan and Arikbog.
This war permanently fractured the ideological soul of the empire. Kublai Khan ultimately wins the military conflict, but his political decisions alienate the traditional Mongol base.
What does he do?
Kublai moves the imperial capital away from Karakorum, deep in the rugged Mongolian steppe, down to Dadu, which is modern-day Beijing. He establishes the Yuan dynasty, surrounds himself with Chinese advisors, and adopts sedentary bureaucratic customs.
Imagine you're a hardened nomad warrior. You still live in a felt yurt, you drink fermented mare's milk, and you believe your strength comes from the harshness of the steppe. And you look at your great Khan, the grandson of Genghis, sitting on a static wooden throne wearing silk robes behind a stone wall. To the traditionalists, Kublai wasn't adapting. He was betraying the very essence of what made them Mongols.
That cultural resentment split the empire into four distinct, competing, and eventually warring blocs. You had the Yuan dynasty ruling China and Mongolia under Kublai. You had the Golden Horde dominating the steppes of Russia. You had the Ilkhanate ruling over Persia and the Middle East. And the Chagatai Khanate controlling the rugged heartland of Central Asia.
They still occasionally paid lip service to the idea of a united empire, but practically they were separate nations with their own agendas.
And this political fragmentation made them deeply vulnerable to a completely different kind of enemy. Because the very thing that made them incredibly wealthy, their hyper-connected global trade network, became the instrument of their own destruction.
The biological disaster.
The Silk Roads that allowed merchants, astronomers, and diplomats to cross Eurasia safely also provided the perfect high-speed superhighway for the Euthymia pestis bacterium. In the 1340s, the bubonic plague, the Black Death, hitched a ride on Mongol grain carts and merchant caravans.
The death toll is almost impossible to comprehend. It ripped through the interconnected empire, killing between 30 and 50% of the population across Eurasia.
The demographic collapse was fatal to the Mongol state structure. It decimated their tax base, utterly paralyzed the yam relay system, and severed the trade routes that funded their armies. And to make matters worse, this biological apocalypse coincided with an environmental one.
The return of the Little Ice Age?
The climate that had warmed to fuel their initial expansion suddenly reversed. Temperatures dropped significantly across the hemisphere. This drastically reduced grass production on the steppes.
Which means no horses.
Exactly. Remember, the entire foundation of Mongol military supremacy was the horse. When the grass died, the massive horse herd starved. The ecological engine of the Mongol military machine simply stalled out.
And let's be honest about the human element, too. If you are the great-grandson of a Mongol conqueror, but you were born in a wealthy Persian estate or a Chinese palace, you grew up eating off porcelain plates. You weren't foraging for roots in the snow like Temüjin. Did they simply lose their martial edge?
They did. The ruling elites assimilated into the luxurious sedentary cultures they had conquered. They lost the martial hardiness, the extraordinary horsemanship, and the rugged endurance that made the initial conquest possible. At the same time, the rest of the world caught up.
The technological gap closed.
Rapidly. The sedentary empires studied Mongol tactics, and crucially, the technology of warfare evolved, ironically because of the Mongols themselves. The gunpowder they spread to the west led to the rise of early firearms. Suddenly, a foot soldier with a primitive gun could pierce the armor of a highly trained horse archer. The era of nomadic cavalry dominance was over.
The aura of Mongol invincibility completely shatters, and we see this spectacularly in the failed invasions of Japan. Kublai Khan demands submission from Japan, and when they refuse, he launches two massive naval armadas in 1274 and 1281. Nomads trying to wage amphibious warfare.
It was a disaster. The fleets were largely destroyed by massive typhoons before they could establish a foothold.
The famous kamikaze, the divine winds, which the Japanese genuinely believed were sent by the gods to protect them from the Mongol hordes.
With their military supremacy gone, their populations hollowed out by plague, and their leadership fractured by infighting, the great Khanates collapsed one by one. The Ilkhanate in Persia descended into anarchy by the 1350s, and in 1368, the native Han Chinese Ming dynasty successfully rebelled, pushed the Mongols out of Beijing, and forced the remnants of the Yuan court to flee back into the northern steppes.
The global empire vanished. The crater was empty. But the imprint they left on the map of the world was permanent. The geopolitical reality we live with today was forged in that crater.
Absolutely. The Mongols fundamentally reshaped the macropolitics of Eurasia. Look at China. Before the Mongols, China was frequently fractured into northern and southern dynasties. The Mongols unified it into a single administrative bloc, and it largely remained unified under the subsequent Ming and Qing dynasties.
And the impact on Russia is even more profound. Before the Mongols arrived, Russia wasn't a country. It was a loose, squabbling collection of principalities, mostly centered around Kievan in the south.
The Kievan Rus. But the Golden Horde smashed that structure. To manage their vast Russian territories, the Mongols didn't want to collect taxes from 100 different princes. They elevated the princes of an obscure northern trading post called Moscow to act as their primary tax collectors.
They gave Moscow the monopoly on power.
Yes. This centralized wealth and authority in Moscow. When the Russian state eventually grew strong enough to challenge and push out the Golden Horde, traditionally marked by the Great Stand on the Ugar River in 1480, it emerged as a unified, centralized, highly autocratic Russian state modeled in many ways on the Mongol administrative and military structures that had ruled them for 2 centuries.
And the ripple effects kept going. The Mongol invasions of the Middle East pushed various Turkic tribes westward into Anatolia as refugees. One of those displaced groups was the Osmanli, who settled there and eventually founded the Ottoman Empire.
And in India, you have the Mughal Empire, which built the Taj Mahal. The very word Mughal is simply the Persian and Arabic word for Mongol. The founder of the Mughal Empire, Babur, traced his direct lineage back to Genghis Khan on his mother's side. For centuries, the Chinggisid lineage, the blood of Genghis Khan, was the absolute gold standard for political legitimacy across Central Asia. If you wanted to rule, you had to prove you were part of the Golden Family.
Which brings us to the genetic legacy, which is just staggering. Modern genomic analysis has revealed that a significant percentage of men living across the region of the former Mongol Empire carry a unique Y chromosome lineage. It points back to a single common ancestor living around the 12th century, widely believed by geneticists to be Genghis Khan or his immediate family. It is a physical, biological footprint of absolute conquest.
But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of the Mongol legacy today is the dissonance in how they are remembered. The cultural memory is completely bifurcated depending on where you stand on the globe.
It's night and day. If you read the histories written in the Middle East or Eastern Europe, the memory is tied purely to the trauma. The destruction of the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, the burning of Kiev, they are viewed historically as the horsemen of the apocalypse, the ultimate destroyers of high civilization.
But if you cross the border into modern Mongolia, the narrative is completely inverted. During the 20th century, the Soviet Union dominated Mongolia and violently suppressed the memory of Genghis Khan, labeling him a feudal oppressor to keep Mongolian nationalism in check. But following the Democratic Revolution and the fall of communism in 1990, Genghis Khan was resurrected.
He became the ultimate symbol of the nation. If you fly into Ulaanbaatar today, you literally land at Genghis Khan International Airport, you drive down Genghis Khan Avenue, you pay for your coffee with tugriks, the national currency, which has his face printed right on the bills. You can even buy premium Genghis Khan brand vodka.
He is celebrated not merely as a conqueror, but as a proto-democratic icon. Mongolians point to his establishment of the Kurultai Assembly, his implementation of a written rule of law through the Yasa, and his strict diplomatic codes. He represents Mongolian unity, resilience, and their historical moment at the absolute center of the world.
And I have to mention the bizarre pop culture footprint, because it just highlights how strange historical memory can be. In 1979, West Germany's entry into the Eurovision Song Contest was a disco band literally called Genghis Khan, dressed in sequined capes, singing a wildly catchy, historically absurd disco anthem about him drinking and partying.
It's a surreal testament to the sheer, unavoidable scale of his historical footprint. From a terrifying conqueror who wiped out millions, to the revered father of a modern democratic nation, to a European disco hit. I mean, his name echoes in ways he never could have conceptualized when he was wearing that wooden collar.
Which brings us to a final, uncomfortable thought to leave you with. We started this deep dive looking for the invisible architect standing in the crater. And when we look at that crater, we are faced with a terrifying paradox.
The Mongol Empire was forged in oceans of blood. Entire civilizations were systematically erased, and unimaginable atrocities were committed not out of passion, but as a matter of calculated, cold state policy.
Yet, out of that absolute devastation came the hard wiring of the modern interconnected world. The Mongols championed global free trade. They established diplomatic immunity. They enforced religious tolerance. They connected East and West, spreading paper money, the compass, the printing press, and life-saving medical knowledge.
It forces us to ask a deeply unsettling question about the mechanics of human progress.
Exactly. Can an era of unprecedented global integration and technological progress ever truly wash away the blood of its creation? Or are the forces of creation and destruction, the architects of our world and the bringers of the apocalypse, always uncomfortably bound together in the human story? Can you have the globalized peace without the molten silver? As you go about your day, think about that invisible architect, the man with no portrait, whose violent impact created the very networks we still rely on today. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the past, keep exploring the sources, and we'll catch you next time.